welcome to the Internet Reloaded Boston. I'm with Katrina Pugh from Columbia University. Katrina, can I quickly ask you to introduce yourself, what you're responsible for at Columbia University?
Yes, I run a program that is in a hybrid format, a combination of in-person and virtual. It's about 16 months. It's a Master's of Science, and it's called Information and Knowledge Strategy for good reason, because it's an interesting blend of information management and collaboration. So it's kind of this left brain, right brain thing going on. And our students come from all over the world. They come from Europe, they come from Asia, all over the United States, Canada, of course. And it is just an incredibly vibrant community. We have actively engaged alumni and faculty from all over the world.
That's great. So what has brought you to the Internet Reloaded Boston this year?
I'm an insider. Believe it or not, your Master of Ceremonies, Bob Libby, is one of my faculty, and he is a very good friend. He inspired me to come and introduce me to your colleagues.
All right. And what are your first impressions of the event so far?
I've attended a lot of conferences, probably more than I want to count. This has been more engaging, not only because the speakers are clearly interested in us as listeners and clearly connected to the world. They're applying these ideas. They're telling stories that are meaningful. But the group seems to be incredibly warm. There's a sense of interest in each other in ways that is really difficult to do in a large conference. But there's something that is sort of magical about this community that I think would even scale.
That's great. Yeah, building the community. That's what we've been trying to do. How about your topic and your research? Can you quickly introduce us to all of that?
Yes, I can. So what I talked about today was how we activate tacit knowledge. And what I talked about initially was the fact that our tacit knowledge is very similar to kind of the habits that live right down in the basal ganglia of our brain. You think to yourself, wait a minute, that's an anatomy term. So what I did at the beginning of the talk was I said, we have this incredible brain, and we use a huge amount of our energy to go and look and grab information, what we do in our prefrontal cortex. And we work together between our prefrontal cortex and our hippocampus to kind of make sense of the world. And it uses so much energy that we tend, over time, to put all these ideas, not all of them, but selectively put ideas into habit. That's where tacit knowledge is. It goes down to this thing called the basal ganglia. And what I tried to show the group is that when we pay attention to what we know, and when we do it collectively, we can actually change the circuitry of our brains. And analogously, we can change the circuitry of our organizations. But the only way we can do that is if we really are attentive to these kinds of ideas. And it's very hard to do when there is so much fragmentation. I shared a slide where I had all of these things that we are barraged with, hundreds of emails, Twitter feeds, responsibilities in this time of the year, our tax returns. And with all of that, it is very, very hard to focus and to intentionally create memory, or it's really hard to focus and to intentionally bring out ideas, which we have to do in no small part because a lot of our organizations are turning over employees, we're changing teams, people are retiring. We need to be able to elicit that tacit knowledge. So what I talked about ultimately was conversation is like yoga for the brain. But even more so, conversation is like yoga for the organization. By our having conversations about what we know and focusing, and more importantly, sort of scaffolding those conversations with structure, we're better able to co-create knowledge. And it's in that co-creation that we can innovate. So that's where I ended. I ended on the theme that this kind of capability, this ability to pay attention, is absolutely central to innovation. And it comes back down to how our brains work. We need to be able to use attention to go and get that stuff that's living in the very sort of habitual part of our brains, bring it out into the surface, bring it into conversation, and use it to create new ideas, new products, new services. I hope that was helpful.
Yeah, it is, definitely. And it relates to the title of your presentation, I mean, quite clearly.
Out of fragmentation,
Yes,
innovation.
exactly. And then I would ask you, what are the challenges that knowledge practitioners are facing when developing internet platforms? I mean, to your mind, to your research, what would you point out?
What they're challenged to do is they have to be a slave to all people. They have to be something for so many different people. They have the need to be able to focus their content for specific types of problems. But that's really hard to do because there are so many chiefs in those kinds of projects. It's really important for the organization to think, all right, what is the hidden knowledge of our team? What's the hidden knowledge of our group? And how do we use this interactivity on the internet platform to draw that out? How do we focus? How do we pay attention? We often say, let's just go use social media. But social media has added to that fragmentation. So we need to introduce things like the practices of discussion that I shared with you, integrity, courtesy, inclusion, and translation. We need to introduce those kinds of practices so that collectively we can focus on the future. Collectively, we can focus on integrating the past into the future. Does that help?
Yeah, it does. And I mean, in your presentation, you were also talking about collective intelligence. Could you maybe introduce us to the definition of it?
Formally, there is a research institute at MIT that's called the Center for Collective Intelligence. They have a robust definition of the way in which a team over time embodies collective intelligence. In a simple way, what I say is collective intelligence is the combination of the capacity of the team to have conversation over time and the capacity of the team to innovate, the capacity of the team to discover needs in the future, needs in the present and needs in the future, and to be able to share their knowledge in a way that's generative. The opposite of collective intelligence is defensiveness and routine and a refusal to take in the new and the different. So one of the challenges of collective intelligence is really capitalizing on diversity.
Okay, so collective intelligence would basically help enhance the innovation
Of the
let's
organization.
say. And so how can it help the knowledge practitioners in the implementation of an intranet platform, for example?
So if the implementers of an internet platform actually stop and say, what is it that collectively we want to do? What is it that collectively we want to know? How do we put into place the conditions for getting that out? What do we need to do in terms of the tone? What do we need to do in terms of the transactions? What do we need to do in terms of the explicit knowledge that we hold up to ourselves and we look at over time? And how do we do that dynamically? It's one thing for us to say, oh, let's make sure that we have an ontology that works really well for this area. Let's go and roll up our sleeves and build it. But if we can't do it dynamically and adaptively into the future, then we have intelligence point in time, but we don't have intelligence that's collective, not only between us now, but collective to those people whom we can't see. That's what we need to really think about from an internet perspective.
Yeah, definitely. It's a great perspective to have. Now, talking a bit more about the future, what do you think the trends are going to be in the field of intranets in the next, I would say 5 years, but in general in the future? What are the upcoming trends? What do you think?
Well, I like to get sort of starry-eyed with this one. I think what we're discovering with attention is that as human beings, we have a lot more dimensions of communication than people are acknowledging today. We've now degenerated down to tweets and syllables, but in truth, we communicate visually. We communicate with our expression. We communicate with the pitch of our voice. We communicate with the cadence of our voice. We communicate with the frequency of our communication. And what I think is going to happen is that more and more our digital communications are going to resemble our physical communications. I was actually talking to some folks at Gartner recently, and I said, it's probably going to be holograms. And they said, yeah, well, maybe it's going to be holograms. And I've been saying that for a while. I really think that in our future, it's not going to be the word virtual reality. It's going to be some kind of collective reality that's going to give us the ability to get many, many more slices of life into our communication. I think that's an important trend. I think another important trend is that people are going to start thinking about knowledge and knowledge structures at a much younger age. You're going to see kids who are learning, we did in the United States on Sesame Street, one of these things is not like the other. And there was a little tune that went with it. What's going to happen is that's not just going to start at the ages of 5 and 6, but increasingly over time, we're going to start teaching kids about how to think about knowledge, how to think about how they think. And they're going to be much more cognizant of the perils of fragmentation, the perils of information overload. And I think what that's going to do is it's going to bring a generation of people into the workplace for whom it's going to be second nature to think about sharing knowledge. It's going to be second nature to be thinking about cybersecurity. It's going to be second nature to ask questions about what kind of vehicle is appropriate for this kind of communication. Right now, all the young people are using instant message. And I'm using my thumbs because that's what I do with my instant message. Or actually, I use my fingers and my thumbs. I use all of them. Increasingly, they're going to say, at this moment, when I go and break up with my boyfriend, I'm not going to do it on Twitter. I'm going to do it in something that might be a virtual reality.
Okay, interesting. And what do you think are the challenges that this generation is going to have to face?
I think this generation is breaking with the past in ways that are a quantum difference. I think we can all sort of trace a pathway. In this conference, we can trace a pathway from where we were 10 years ago, using Lotus Notes, trying to use some kind of sharing. We didn't know what social media was. Social media didn't really show up on the scenes until about 2007. And we've sort of gradually taken this step over there. But I think what's going to happen is this younger generation is going to get into the environment, and there's going to be a pretty radical changing of the guard. And as we heard from Susan Pickles, 40% of her organization is going to be retirement eligible in 5 years. That's a huge number. So she's going to see something where there are going to be people who have a different set of digital skills, but there's going to be a legacy of explicit content that they're going to have to understand. And there's a risk, there's a substantial risk that they don't have the capacity to integrate that content into their lives because it's foreign. It's delivered in a foreign format. When I was studying, when I was in high school and junior high, it was all about writing. And I had notebooks, and I would do my best to make the notebooks pristine because I studied from my notebooks. I know now from my students and from my family members that the younger people would never even think to write, and many of them have appalling handwriting. There's some big changes that are coming, and it may very well be that they're going to have to use some of these new skills about how the brain works and how knowledge works to realize that it may not always be digital that they need to communicate with. And that's going to be a shocker for them. Similarly, the people who are passing the baton, it's going to be a shocker for them to realize that this pile of insight that they have is not as inspirational as they thought it was for this new generation.
Yeah, going through all that, true. What do you expect to gain from the event? I mean, what do you expect to gain from the whole community? What benefit do you want to take back home and maybe bring to your students?
You know, when I signed up for the conference, I said, well, I should probably know everybody here. They're all like me. They've owned intranets. They've deployed SharePoint. They've worked in social media. They've done some lectures. They've done some teaching. Everyone looks like me. And what I'm realizing is there is so much diversity here. I have so much to learn from these people. And there's, as I mentioned before, there's a kind of community here that differs greatly from other conferences. Even though there are some presentations by vendors, I feel like they're educating me, they're not selling to me. And even though there are presentations by veterans who have accomplished something often painstakingly, I don't feel that they are boasting and braggart and impenetrable. I think what they're doing is they're asking me to engage with them. So I expect, as a consequence of being in this conference, that I'm going to have a whole ton of new friends, but I'm also going to be inspired to do something that betters what I teach and betters who I am.
That's great. And one last question I would have, who inspires you? What are, maybe in terms of person, in terms of books, in terms of website, what drives you in what you do every day in your research?
It's very interesting. Well, I have a very great mentor, Larry Prusak, who was, as far as I'm concerned, one of the founders of knowledge management, is a mentor to me and an inspiration. And we have done work together, but he persistently sees that I am a professional colleague, but also somebody he wants to see succeed. And he wants to help me navigate this crazy world that involves all these technical changes, but also changes in humanity. So he's consistently been a mentor. And another person who's also been a tremendous mentor is Nancy Dixon, who, like Larry, is one of the founders of knowledge management. She's been there creating, inventing, and inspiring from the beginning. She's really the backbone behind the research that I did, that I presented today. I admire her greatly. She actually wrote in the front of my book, Sharing Hidden Know-How, the foreword. And, you know, there are times where I tell people, here's a book. You don't need to read the book, just read the foreword. So they both are big inspirations. I also read a lot. I read things that are from so many different domains. And oftentimes I don't even have enough time to read. So I listen all the time to public radio, and I listen to other speakers, and I listen to many people here. But recently, one of the places I found myself going, because I can get in a lot of my spaces information about knowledge management and business practice and organizational change, what I can't always get is the edge on technology. So I read the technology review, the MIT technology review, and it really helps me not see which technologies are, you know, emergent, but how people care about them and what their impacts are on society. And it's not intended to be that way. I'm sure that plenty of people read it and they just say, oh yeah, check, this is what VCs are investing in. I read it because there's a layer of sociology and sort of reflection on our society that helps me understand where this is all going. Mm-hmm. And by the way, I'm looking for an article on holograms.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much for sharing all this with us. And I hope you enjoy the rest of Internet Reloaded Boston.
I certainly will. Thank you.